So here I begin reading this remarkable book by J.B. Bury. It's written about 1910 or so. English, what would you call him? Thinker, historian. I think he wrote a very popular history of Greece. But he also wrote a book on the idea of progress I've never read. But this is his history of freedom of thought. And I don't mean this. This is by no means a textbook. It's polemical. That is, it's written from a particular point of view and trying to get over a particular view. And that's what we're getting. We're getting Bury's view of the history of the emergence of freedom of thought. I think it's a remarkable book. I don't think anybody would want to just um, think exactly like Bury, but he has some very provocative and interesting things to say about the history of reason and the history of free thought. A couple things in this video I'd just like to emphasize, and I think there's a pretty remarkable comment or two on page 18. And this gives you a notion of like what the maybe the thesis of the book is, or its view. When he says, in the Middle Ages, a large field was covered by beliefs which authority claimed to impose as true, and reason was warned off the ground. He's talking about religious dogma, and he's talking about the dominance of the Catholic Church during the European Middle Ages. So we're talking about that period after the fall of the Roman Empire, let's say about 500 or 600 AD until comparatively recent times, really more than 1,000 years of the dominance of Christian thought over Europe and Western thinking in general. And it's that notion that there is a domain of authority. I think you might remember Thomas Aquinas' remarkable article where he talks about some things coming through revelation and some things coming through reason. And for a medieval thinker, Middle Ages thinker like Thomas Aquinas, that was quite natural that there were fields, or that there were domains in which reason, which is just you and me and the ordinary person or mind thinking a question through, like a Socrates thinking through the question of what is virtue, as opposed to revelation or authority, religious authority, where there are some truths where you just simply have to accept without any evidence, proof, or reasoning behind them. For a thinker like Thomas, that was just the natural way of things. Some things could be discovered by reason, and some things could only be revealed by God. And ultimately, it was the things that were revealed by God that had the highest authority because they came from God. But look at what Bury says next. But reason cannot recognize arbitrary prohibitions or barriers without being untrue to herself. That is, for a thinker like Bury, that idea of different domains for revelation and reason and the ultimate dominance or priority of revelation over reason, Bury thinks that that is a betrayal of reason itself, or if reason were to accept such limitations, she would be being untrue to herself. He continues, the universe of experience is her province, and as its parts are all linked together and interdependent, it is impossible for her to recognize any territory in which she may not tread, whether that's religion, science, politics, art, culture. The notion, and this really, I think, should remind you of Kant's outlook. Reason must be free to discover for herself the truth of things. Um, and whether that truth ultimately is aligned with religious belief or whether it's not, the chips have to fall where they may. It is impossible for her, for reason, to recognize any territory in which she may not tread, or to surrender any of her rights to an authority whose credentials she has not examined and approved. So everything is up for grabs when it comes to the criticism of things, whether that's criticism of, again, of religion, of scientific theory, of political theory. Reason has the right to always look for the basis of things and try to think questions through. And then I would say an even more remarkable statement comes in the next paragraph where he says the uncompromising assertion by reason of her absolute rights throughout the whole domain of thought is termed rationalism. And that's pretty good. I mean, the word rationalism is one that I've mentioned once or twice. It is a word that has lots of different connotations, different senses. Bury has given quite an interesting idea of it. It's not the only idea of what rationalism means, but the uncompromising assertion by reason of her absolute rights throughout the whole domain of thought is termed rationalism. That is, there's no aspect of thought, of reality, of our relation with reality, which is not the domain of reason, which reason does not have the right to inquire into. So, what are the much of the essay is really about the forces that are marshaled against reason. And reason is what? Reason is free thinking, freedom of thought. He goes on to say the term is limited to the field of theology because it was in that field that the self assertion of reason was most violently and pertinaciously opposed. In the same way, free thought, the refusal of thought to be controlled by any authority but its own, has a definitely theological reference. So it was in the realm of religion most clearly, most definitely, that authority was said and still is said to have its its rights, and the idea that you should be free to inquire into everything, the existence of God, the nature of the universe, whether religion is true or not, and questions like that. We may take that for granted, that kind of rationalism, where there's no barriers to what reason can inquire freely into. But really, the book is about how that idea came to be. And that's another, the other thought that I'd like to just emphasize out of many interesting things in this. And that is, Bury is writing around 1900 in England, and he's saying that people in our society, and I'm sure it's true of American society, that too, just take for granted that free speech is just part of life. You should be free to say whatever you want, to inquire into whatever you want, right? Kant would say, everyone has the right to be the scholar addressing the public in the public use of reason. But really, the book is about how that right was emerged and finally was asserted in European history. And it's quite interesting, but the history of it. But the main philosophical point is that free speech isn't a natural right at all. it's a custom or tradition, you might say. And he has a very interesting passage here. I guess starts on page 12, in which he gives all the sort of reasons for prohibiting some speech or limiting speech. He talks about, well, there's natural rights like the right to preserve your life and the right to reproduce, but at least in his society, both of those are limited. You can't do just anything to preserve your life, and at least custom frowns upon, what does he say, promiscuous reproduction. Maybe that's a little old-fashioned, but and so if those definite natural rights are curtailed and seemingly justly curtailed, then certainly the limitation of freedom of speech can be curtailed. And then he gives all sorts of reasons for why it might be curtailed. That the feeling that the new ideas that emerge from the use of reason can be dangerous, and or at least perceived as dangerous. And although I think Bury thinks that most of that way of thinking is fallacious, that it's just simply not true, that ideas are dangerous, he does leave open the possibility that free thinking can upset the social order and cause maybe negative things that happen in society. And if we look around the world today, there is any number of places in which there isn't free speech, or in which at least free speech is dangerous and its protection is not total. In some places, there's no free speech. In some places, free speech has definite limits. I mean, there are authoritarian governments all around the world in which you can go to jail for criticizing government. Dear Lord, Alexei Navalny, the Russian dissident, was basically murdered in jail, died in jail a few days ago. For what? For criticizing Putin, for criticizing the government. He was a political prisoner. So the stakes are still high in a lot of places. And there are certainly any number of people who consider the kind of free thinkers or rationalists or the use of reason without fetters to be a threat. I mean, Russia, definitely one place, probably China, dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party, um, and then other countries that used to have a lot of free speech really are cracking down. India is a good example. And, who knows what will happen in the United States if we slide towards authoritarianism. So, what we take for granted, um, maybe, the right to speak freely about whatever subject we want, is actually a very tenuous right. And even more than that, maybe there are arguments on the other side that are not necessarily bad arguments for the restriction of speech. So who knows?